Hello people! This is me, this is what I actually look like. In this video, we're doing something a little bit different, as I'll be explaining the entire lore of time and timeline of Pokemon, or at least the parts that we know. And the video will be split into 3 parts. Part 1 is just going over the historical events in the mythology of the Pokemon world, so everything that happens before the modern day basically. Then in the second part, I'll be going over the timeline of the games themselves, so the events that we see when we actually play Pokemon, along with how many years I think passed between each Pokemon game. And then I'll have another section at the end where I'll explain how I pieced together that timeline. And I have my notes on my phone, so that's why I'll keep looking at it. I will stick to canon stuff only. I'm not making anything up. But if I do include any kind of speculation or uncertain information, then I will clarify that so that you don't get confused about what's canon and what's just implied or speculated. We're only doing the games universe, so we're not using information from the anime or the manga, even if it would complete the story in certain instances. We're just sticking to what we're told from game universe media. And then also I need to make it clear that when it comes to myths and legends, a lot of that is unclear and vague, and even though the people of the Pokemon universe tell those legends and they believe those things to be true, they might not be entirely accurate. So you know, take them with a grain of salt, because it's much like folklore in the real world, where it's probably inspired by something that happened, but maybe not entirely accurate. I will cover things in chronological order more or less, but there will be some cases where I need to jump back and forth a bit, just so that I can cover a subject in full from beginning to end. And also, if I'm not giving the date for when something happened, then just assume that we don't know the date. So it might not have happened in that order specifically, it just happened vaguely in the past. The first event we're covering is the first event to ever happen, because it's the creation myth and the beginning of the Pokemon universe. Now, according to mythology in the Pokemon world, the universe started when Arceus was born. So that's our first thing on the board. Arceus is known as the alpha Pokemon, and whether it created the universe or it just came into existence at the same time as the universe is a bit ambiguous. And another thing I want to clarify is that Arceus, the broader god, and Arceus, the Pokemon, are not quite the same. The normal type Pokemon that we call Arceus is just a piece of Arceus, the god, which is greater than just a Pokemon. This information comes from Arceus itself, so we know this for sure. After Arceus was born, it created 3 more Pokemon. There was Dialga and Palkia, who are said to be the rulers of time and space. It is said that time flows because of Dialga's presence, and that time expands with a Palkia's presence. And they're seen as deities of those 2 concepts respectively. But like I said, there was a 3rd dragon Pokemon that was created after Arceus. These 2 are dragon types, by the way. And the 3rd one is Giratina. Now, Giratina doesn't embody a specific aspect of the universe, like time and space. It more so embodies destruction itself. It's known as the Renegade Pokemon, and it was banished by Arceus to the Distortion world for its chaotic and destructive nature. But also, the form that Giratina takes in the Distortion world is called its origin form, which to me seems to imply that the Distortion world is where Giratina was first born. So think of it maybe as Arceus sending its child back to its room and telling it to stay there. But that's just my interpretation of it. But yeah, we got these 3, and they embody the physical universe, so to speak. We got time, space, and antimatter / destruction. That's just the stuff that you can touch, physical phenomenon. But there's 3 other Pokemon that came into being that embody the metaphysical universe, so to speak. We got the Lake Guardians, as they came to be known, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf. And they each embody a different aspect of the mind. All 3 of them are psychic type Pokemon. Uxie is said to have given humankind knowledge and the desire to pursue discovery. Mesprit is said to have given humans emotion, the ability to feel, while Azelf brought willpower to mankind, the wish to persevere and do things and have objectives. So you can see how they're kind of counterparts of these 3. These are called the Creation Trio by fans, and they, like I said, they created the universe as it exists physically, while these 3 created the mental aspects of the universe, the intangible stuff that you can't interact with physically, but is still important to what existence is. And now, to jump forward in time a little bit, after humans appeared on the planet, the first people of the Sinnoh region, which is the source of all of this mythology that we know of, were the Celestica people, which I have represented here through Volo. They were the first people to worship Arceus, and they used to call it Almighty Sinnoh. It's also where the name of the region comes from, and they're the reason we have all of this information in the first place. So I'm gonna place them here. Now, at some point, other people started coming into Sinnoh, and they too called themselves the Celestica people, but they weren't the original ones. They were people who came from other regions and kind of took on their religion and beliefs. And they sort of replaced the original Celestica people who went to other parts of the world. They went to, they built the Sinjo ruins with the help of the people of Johto. And they're located in an area somewhere between Sinnoh and Johto, and otherwise there's not many known members of this faction. But the Celestica people that replaced them at some point began having internal conflicts about how they perceived their god, Almighty Sinnoh. What happened is that they conflated Arceus for Dialga and Palkia. The people who believed that Almighty Sinnoh, the creator of the world, was actually a time deity like Dialga, became known as the Diamond Clan. And I'll put them here. Maybe to move back a bit. Didn't think about that. And then the people who believed Almighty Sinnoh, Arceus, to be a deity of space, so in reality Palkia, were known as the Pearl Clan. And even though they have nearly identical beliefs, aside from their interpretation of Arceus' nature and power, they completely despise each other, and they have a long history of bloody fighting. And again, they replace the actual original people of Sinnoh. Next up in the history of the Pokemon world, after the whole cosmological thing, is the earliest stages of the planet that the games take place on, which is sort of a mirror of ours with some supernatural elements, such as the existence of Pokemon. At some point in the past, when the Earth was still being formed, 3 legendary Pokemon were born. There was Groudon, who was born deep underground and became known as the Continent Pokemon. And according to legend, Groudon shaped the land masses of the planet as we know them to be. And then there was Kyogre, the Sea Basin Pokemon, who was born deep in the ocean and is said to have shaped the seas of the planet. Now these two, as you can probably guess, would constantly come into conflict because their goals are basically opposite. What Groudon does is that it creates heat waves so intense that oceans begin to evaporate, expanding the land, while Kyogre creates torrential rains that fill up the ocean and expand the sea. So whenever they met, they would battle each other, and they'd be bloody battles. It'd be horrible, destructive, and lengthy. But a third Pokemon was also born sometime around this time, and that's the Sky High Pokemon, Rayquaza, who was born in the sky in the ozone layer and is the only Pokemon strong enough to be able to stop the fights between Groudon and Kyogre. Whenever their fights went too far or were too chaotic, Rayquaza would intervene and put an end to it. Also in the early stages of the planet, a Pokemon called Mew appeared. Now, whether Mew appeared before Groudon and Kyogre or after isn't known, but we just know that Mew is extremely old. It's a mythical Pokemon, and it carries the genetic material for every other Pokemon species within its own DNA. So Mew is like a cradle for Pokemon life. It can turn into other Pokemon, and it encapsulates the entirety of the Pokemon mega species. And because of this, in the modern day, a lot of people regard Mew as an ancestor. I'll just put it here. As an ancestor of all Pokemon, I personally don't think that's exactly true. I don't know if Mew evolved into every other Pokemon through natural selection, but nonetheless it's related to all of them. Also, at some point in the past, there were legends about a Pokemon called Regigigas, and how it pulled the continents with ropes. Again, this is a legend. I highly doubt it did that. That sounds impossible, but it's a really old Pokemon. And in its journeys around the planet, it used various materials from the Earth or that it encountered to make more like itself. not other Regigigas, but other Pokemon with Regi in the names called the legendary Titans. So using metal, it created Registeel, using stone, it created Regirock, and using ice, it created Regice. But it also created Regieleki from electricity and Regidrago from crystallized dragon energy, whatever that means. 30,000 years before the modern day, a meteorite hit the planet, and this Pokemon, Eternatus, that came from space, that's why it looks so strange, was sleeping inside of it. This will become important later, but yeah, it happened 30,000 years ago. So I'll put it here. Another legend from the past of the Pokemon world is about the creation of the Unova region. According to legend, there used to be two brothers who were both the trainers of an extremely powerful legendary dragon-type Pokemon. We don't know the name or appearance of this Pokemon, but when the two brothers began having disagreeing views, the Pokemon that saw them as its masters split into two because it couldn't pick one to follow. And it became the two Pokemon that we know of now, Zekrom and Reshiram. That's two halves of the same original dragon, as people call it. And I'll put them over here. Oh no. Okay, that can be edited. The two brothers began fighting with the legendary dragon-type Pokemon at their side, and the two were evenly matched. There wasn't a winner because the two dragon-type Pokemon were equal in strength, and the brothers were equally experienced in using them for battle. And because of that, the two brothers decided to make peace and stop the conflict. But the conflict brought destruction to the Unova region that they ruled over initially. Even though peace came after this, future generations, the offspring of the two brothers, also took ownership of Reshiram and Zekrom and once again used them to fight. And throughout the ages, Reshiram and Zekrom had various masters. Whenever their masters weren't around, they turned into two little balls called the Dark and Light Stones that they hibernated inside of, or transformed into the stones, until another hero came and became the new owner of the Pokemon. But there is a third dragon in this story, Kyurem. Now, it is speculated within the Pokemon world that Kyurem is the shell of the original dragon that was formed when Reshiram and Zekrom split from it. So Kyurem isn't quite like a fully formed being, it's an incomplete husk, if you will. And because of this, using an item called the DNA Splicers, Kyurem has the ability to fuse with either Reshiram and Zekrom and become Kyurem White or Kyurem Black. But there is another legend about Kyurem that doesn't quite line up with this theory. Again, this is not a theory I have, it's a theory that exists in the Pokemon world about Kyurem being part of the original dragon with Reshiram and Zekrom. But the other legend about it was told in Lacunosa town, which is close to the giant chasm where Kyurem slumbers. According to the people of Lacunosa, Kyurem came from space, and in the past it used to eat people. And the people of Lacunosa hid from it within the boundaries of their city, hence why Kyurem is known as the boundary Pokemon. Obviously, both of these things can't be true, because if Kyurem came from the original dragon, that means it couldn't have come from space, but perhaps the people of the past merely thought it did. Perhaps when the original dragon separated, Kyurem fell to Earth and the people assumed it came from space. Or perhaps the original dragon initially came from space before it met the two brothers, and they mistook Kyurem for the original dragon. We don't know. Once again, this is folklore. To go over other legends in Unova's past, we have the Swords of Justice. We have... Ooh, I might not have enough pins actually. We have Cobalion. We have Terrakion. We have Virizion. And then we have Keldeo. And this is where their story begins, because these three, they're Pokemon that used to protect other weaker Pokemon from humans. So whenever humans did harm to the environment, they would drive them off and try and protect the Pokemon and the nature in the area. At some point, a human conflict caused a fire in Unova, I think where Isiris Moor now is, and a bunch of Pokemon perished, sadly. This Pokemon, Keldeo, was separated from its family, and so the three legendary Swords of Justice took Keldeo under their wings and trained it to become a member of their group. And that's the only thing that we really know about them. And then we have the forces of nature. We got Landorus, Tornadus, Thundurus, and most recently, Enamorus. The thing with them is that they appear in different places of the Pokemon world. Most notably, they appear in Unova and Hisui. And in Unova, there's legends about how Thundurus and Tornadus used to fight and create horrible weather. That was just a pain for everyone. And whenever that happened, much like with Rayquaza, the leader of the group, the strongest one, Landorus, would show up and calm them down. And also Landorus fertilized the land, and it made it easier for people to grow crops and such, which is why some people worship it. In fact, in Eastern Unova, there's a location called the Abundant Shrine, where all they do is pray to Landorus and worship it. Also, they have Therian forms where they turn into animals, but that's neither here or there. And then also in Unova, we have Victini, a mythical Pokemon of unknown origin. It is said to bring incredible luck and victory to anyone who possesses it. And about 200 years ago, a rich family got their hands on it, and either for wanting to protect it or maybe because they wanted to keep it for themselves, they locked Victini up in a basement on an island where it stayed for 200 years. And that's all we know about it, really. Now it's time for one of my favorite aspects of Pokemon lore, because it's the legends and lore of the Alola region, my favorite region from my favorite games. But this story actually doesn't start in Alola, it starts in Ultra Space, which is a concept I'll need to explain to you. Basically, in Pokemon, there's these things called Ultra Wormholes that connect our world to Ultra Space. Sometimes Ultra Space itself is described as a different dimension, but it acts more like a hub, a tunnel, or a flux that connects different dimensions to each other and to the main world of the Pokemon universe. The Pokemon that come from Ultra Space are strange both in appearance and behavior, and they're very tough, and they're called Ultra Beasts. One of the Pokemon that comes from Ultra Space that isn't quite an Ultra Beast but is very similar to one is Necrozma, who I stupidly printed without a border so you can barely see it. It's basically a giant light dragon vampire thing, and it's extremely powerful. Now, a long time ago, the people of a different dimension from a town called Ultra Megalopolis attempted to harvest Necrozma's light. And in the process, they injured it very badly. And now it's speculated by people in the Pokemon world that the shards that came off of Necrozma's body when it was injured by the people of Ultra Megalopolis came to Alola through Ultra Space and became the Z crystals that you can use in the Alola games. But after Necrozma was injured, in an attempt to heal itself, it started absorbing all of the light of the world that it was in. And so the people of Ultra Megalopolis and the rest of that dimension were left without light for the rest of time. And nowadays, the people who come from there, they more or less look like humans, but they have pale blue skin, presumably because they had to adapt to living in darkness. But they did manage to capture Necrozma and stop it from rampaging, at least for now. Now, to go to Alola, I promise this connects. The region is an archipelago with 4 main islands, and every one of the 4 islands has its own guardian. Mele Mele Island has Tapu Koko. Akala Island has Tapu Lele. Ula Ula Island has Tapu Bulu. And Pawnee Island has Tapu Fini. But back in the day, they used to travel between the islands as messengers, but each one of them calls one of the 4 islands its home. In the past, at some point, an Ultra Wormhole opened in Alola, and Pokemon came out of it. It was similarly powerful legendary Pokemon to Necrozma called Solgaleo and Lunala, emissaries of the Sun and Moon, respectively. When they came to Alola, they started battling the 4 Tapus, but even though their battle was fierce and the Tapus were defeated, it created a friendship between the 2 parties. And Solgaleo and Lunala began leaving their offspring in Alola, Pokemon named Cosmog that can evolve into either one of them, and also gave the Tapus a Z crystal that only they could use. After that, also in the past, Necrozma broke free from Ultra Megalopolis and came to Alola to steal its light. Maybe it came there because it was coming after Solgaleo, Lunala, or the Cosmog, because they emit light in a similar way to stars, and so Necrozma can use them as a food source. It was basically a giant cataclysm that almost stole the light of Alola, and they just barely managed to defeat Necrozma with the help of Solgaleo and Lunala. In the coming years, Solgaleo and Lunala began to be worshipped in Alola as Pokemon from other worlds, along with the Tapus, who were always worshipped. But Necrozma was defeated and somehow recaptured, although we do not know how. One of the most melancholic and tragic stories from the Pokemon world is the story of a man named AZ. AZ came to the Kalos region a little over 3,000 years ago, and he had immense knowledge on technology. He could create various fantastical inventions that would help people, and he had with him a Pokemon called Floette that he received from his mother. Now this is a Floette that holds a flower that no longer blooms in the modern day, and that's why it looks different from the Floette that we know of today. He was very close to this Pokemon, and he was just going around helping the people of Kalos, but they eventually made him their king because of the prosperity that he brought to the region. But even though AZ's intentions were most likely completely pure, the fact that Kalos thrived and grew caused wars to start, and at some point the region became engaged in a horrible conflict. Obviously, in this universe, people would use Pokemon for war, and so many Pokemon were sent to fight on the behalf of humans in this conflict. And at some point, AZ's beloved Floette was drafted. It was recruited in the war, and it perished in a battle. I don't know how they were able to force the king to forfeit his Pokemon. Maybe he wasn't king by then. Maybe there was a revolution. I don't know. Maybe it was his brother. But after Floette died, AZ became extremely enraged. He was angry that people would start wars, and I think he became disillusioned with mankind because after helping Kalos so much, all that came of it was the death of his closest partner. So he built a device shaped like a flower that he could use to bring his Floette back to life. The only caveat to that is that he had to use the lives of other Pokemon as a battery to bring Floette back, and that's exactly what he did. He was so sorrowful, he was so sad that he didn't even care anymore, and he revived his Floette, turning it immortal. And after that, his Floette became known as the Eternal Flower Floette. But his rage hadn't subsided. He was so angry that he converted his creation to bring back Floette into something that would later be dubbed the ultimate weapon, and he used it to end the war. He fired the weapon into the sky, and it caused so much destruction on the planet that the conflict subsided. And it's also speculated by the people of the Pokemon world that after the weapon was fired, the Mega Evolution phenomenon began to occur. Professor Sycamore claims that perhaps the radiation from the weapon turned minerals of the Pokemon world, or evolution stones, into mega stones and keystones, the things that are used to enable Pokemon to mega evolve. But that'll become a little bit more important later. And when Floette saw what her master turned into, someone who killed this many people and sacrificed other Pokemon to revive her, she left AZ. And even though the war had ended, he had lost everything, and it turns out that the ultimate weapon made him immortal as well. So he was forced to roam the earth for 3,000 years by himself, and he came to really regret what he did. And so he buried the ultimate weapon, and the location of where it was buried was passed down in AZ's family by his brother. And so his brother's descendants are the only people who know where the weapon is. Also 3,000 years ago, an event known as the Darkest Day happened. AZ was present for this, and it happened in the Galar region, but we don't know for sure if it happened before or after the ultimate weapon was fired, but AZ was there to see it. In Galar, Eternatus, the Pokemon that was asleep in the meteor that I mentioned earlier, awoke. We don't know what woke it up, but it's a popular fan theory that it was the ultimate weapon firing that awoke Eternatus. When Eternatus came out of the meteor, it started spewing energy throughout the Galar region and caused Pokemon to undergo a phenomenon known as Dynamax, where they grow huge, they start glowing red, and they become a lot more destructive. Obviously, this was a problem for Galar, so someone had to stop it. Two heroes from the region teamed up with the legendary Pokemon Zacian and Zamazenta to stop Eternatus and put an end to the darkest day, which they succeeded, and Eternatus went back to sleep in its meteor. The problem is that the mention of Zacian and Zamazenta in the records of this event didn't exist. People forgot that they were involved with this, and over the years, the Pokemon became lost media. And people didn't know who they were or that they helped with stopping the darkest day. I guess people just assumed that it was an ambiguous human hero that stopped it, and they forgot about these two dogs, which becomes important later. Also in Galar, there's a legendary Pokemon called Calyrex. In the southern part of the region in the Crown Tundra, it can fuse with its steed, another legendary Pokemon that it rides, so either Glastrier or Spectrier, and it has the power to make crops grow, and it was revered as a small local deity by the people of the Crown Tundra. I'm gonna put it here. But over time, people also forgot about Calyrex, and it just so happens that Calyrex's power comes from people believing in it, and so when people forgot about it and it faded into legend, it lost its steed, it lost its power, and part of its memories. But that will be solved later too. About 2,000 years ago, again, AZ is still around, even though 1,000 years have passed since the ultimate weapon fired because he's immortal. He made his way to where Lumio City is now, in Kalos, and as a way of atoning for what he did with the ultimate weapon, he built a device that was meant to serve as its counterpart, and he called it Angie. Basically a giant tower that can channel the powers of Floette, and it's meant to serve as a guardian of Lumio City. Now, how exactly Angie functions is unclear, but it needs Floette as a power source. And at the time, AZ did not have Floette, so people also kind of forgot that Angie was a thing, and they started building around and over the tower, and Lumio City was formed, with only a few people knowing that Angie ever even existed. Another thing that happened 2,000 years ago is that Groudon and Kyogre started fighting again, and Rayquaza stopped them like it always does. But what was different this time is that there were humans who witnessed the event. And so a group of people called the Draconids were formed in the Hoenn region who worshipped Rayquaza and kept a record of all the times in history when it came to aid people. A small but unrelated legend in the Kalos region tells us of a mythical Pokemon called Volcanion that apparently the people of southern Kalos used to terraform the plateau that lies south of the region where they live. Now, whether one Volcanion did all that or multiple, or if it didn't even happen, is unclear. It's a very brief mention. But the mountain range and plateau most likely extends into the northeastern side of Paldea, based on where the Kalos and Paldea regions are inspired by. They should connect around that area where the plateau is. In Scarlet and Violet, when you go to Paldea, you see a big plateau just out of reach on the map, and I just feel like it's related to the whole Volcanion thing. We don't know. That's just my theory. But anyway, speaking of Paldea, also around 2,000 years ago, the Paldean Empire starts. So that's not quite what the Paldea region is now, but there's an empire in the area, and their king is obsessed with going to the Great Crater in the center of Paldea to find treasure. A lot of what this empire's motives are relate to looking for treasure within the crater. At some point during the reign of the Paldean Empire's king, he received 4 treasures from a merchant from the east. Now, the 4 treasures ended up being Pokemon, pretty evil Pokemon called the Treasures of Ruins, or the Ruinous Quartet, who wreaked havoc around Paldea and had to be later sealed. Much like with many other legendaries, they faded into myth, but I forgot to print them out, so you'll have to imagine them here. 1,000 years ago, another meteor, which, you know, they're pretty common in Pokemon apparently, hits the Hoenn region, and the crater that is formed becomes what is now Sootopolis City. But because the meteor hit the Earth, the ground began to crack, and primal energy began spewing from the planet's core, which, surprise, surprise, awoke Groudon and Kyogre. Groudon and Kyogre, as they existed in the past, were in their primal forms, but they need this primal energy to sustain these forms, otherwise they return to to their regular forms. They awoke and they began fighting over the primal energy from the earth, and Rayquaza once again had to stop them. The people were desperate because their fight was even worse than before, but the Draconids, who remember that Rayquaza helped them 1,000 years before this, began to pray to Rayquaza, praying that it would come and end the fight like it did 1,000 years prior. When they did that, a light enveloped the meteor that had fallen and started this whole conflict, and Rayquaza's body began to glow. And then it performed the first known Mega Evolution in the history of Pokemon, and Rayquaza turned into Mega Rayquaza. It became a lot more powerful and was once again able to stop Groudon and Kyogre, and the Draconid people rejoiced. But they did predict that in another 1,000 years, an even bigger meteor would hit the planet, because as you can probably tell, these events happen every 1,000 years. What was different this time, however, is that AZ was actually present in Hoenn, and he witnessed the first Mega Evolution and dubbed Rayquaza, or rather Mega Rayquaza, the Delta. Now earlier I said that some people in Pokemon have a hypothesis that it was the ultimate weapon firing off the first time that created the Mega Evolution phenomenon, and some of you might be asking, how is that compatible with the idea that Mega Rayquaza Mega evolved with the help of a meteor? Either the whole thing about Mega Evolution coming from the ultimate weapon just isn't true and it's just a false theory, or perhaps when the weapon fired off the first time, some of its radiation reached into space and caused this meteor to gain special properties. We don't know, it's never explained. It was a long time ago. 800 years ago, the Paldean Empire became what is now the Paldea region. It basically united the various factions where Paldea is now into one big power, which became the Paldea region. 200 years ago, a man named Heath went on an expedition within Area Zero, the place within the Great Crater of Paldea, like many people did before, and he encountered a bunch of different things. This is not gonna stay. He encountered a bunch of different things there. He saw Pokemon from other time periods, and a bunch of weird stuff happened to him, so he wrote a book, the Scarlet Book, about his encounters, or the Violet Book if you're playing Pokemon Violet, which became popular, but many people thought he was just lying about the whole thing, so he wasn't very credible as a scientist or as an explorer. About 150 years ago, in the Johto region in Ecruteak City, there used to be two towers. There was the Tin Tower, where Ho-Oh roosted, and then there was the Brass Tower, where Lugia roosted. I'm gonna put them here. At some point, sadly, Lugia's tower burned down after lightning struck it, and even though I think most people managed to escape, there were 3 nameless Pokemon that sadly perished within the fire. But then the rain came and put out the fire. The tower became a ruin that wasn't rebuilt, not even in the modern day. But what happened to the 3 Pokemon that died? Well, Ho-Oh from the other tower showed up after the fire went out, and using its powers, it revived the 3 Pokemon that had perished, and they became the legendary Pokemon Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. But people feared them because they defied death, and so they fled and started roaming the lands, waiting for a worthy trainer. At some point in the past, although presumably pretty close to modern day, in Kitakami, a mysterious location that isn't known to be part of any other established region, there was a man, a foreigner that came from elsewhere, who was friends with a Pokemon named Ogerpon, and he made a bunch of masks for himself and Ogerpon that they would don in Kitakami while they were around other people, because people were scared of them. They thought Ogerpon was scary, and I guess they thought the man was pretty ugly. They became pretty popular afterwards because the masks were really pretty and cool. Word spread that they were here. Meanwhile, somewhere outside of Kitakami, but presumably pretty close, an old couple is said to have found the mythical Pokemon Pecharunt, who can subjugate other beings, including people, and Pokemon to its will by feeding them mochi. Pecharunt really loved these two old people and wanted to please them by any means possible. It would bring them things that it found, but it seems that the two became greedier and greedier the more Pecharunt served them. At some point, they hear about the masks that Ogerpon and the man from Kitakami had, and they begin to covet them. And so Pecharunt sets on a journey to Kitakami to steal the masks and bring them to the old couple. On the way there, Pecharunt realizes that it'll need help, so it creates toxic chains that it uses to bind 3 Pokemon and make them into its servants. So we have Munkidori, Okidogi, and Pheasantipiti, also known as the Loyal 3, who serve Pecharunt and accompanied it to Kitakami. Once they reached the Kitakami, they found and attacked the man who made the masks, and unfortunately killed him and stole 3 of the masks, with the man only managing to preserve 1 of them, although he did lose his life. Ogerpon wasn't around to help the man defend himself, but when it returned to their hideout and saw what happened, Ogerpon became enraged and it chased down the Loyal 3, and well, it killed them too. Because of this, Ogerpon began to be feared by the people of Kitakami once more. After many years, the story of what had happened with the masks was distorted, and people thought that the Loyal 3 were good guys and that Pecharunt was an evil little Pokemon that just wanted to kill them to steal the masks, but it was really its masks, and it wanted them back because the Loyal 3 killed its partner. But yeah, people had forgotten that, sadly, and Ogerpon's rep was pretty much ruined for a long time. You probably figured out by now that I'm kind of running out of pins, but the reason I kept all of these up is just because I kind of wanted to give you an idea of just how many legendary Pokemon exist in Pokemon and how all of them contribute in different ways to the lore and mythology of the world. And this isn't even all of them. It's just the ones that are important to Pokemon's history, and there will be more even within this video. But just look at this. This is like, I feel like it's the perfect representation for how complex Pokemon's pantheon is, because legendary Pokemon are the closest thing this universe has to deities. We finally reached the events of an actual game, and that's Pokemon Legends Arceus. The reason I'm including Legends Arceus in the prehistory section of the video is because it doesn't happen in the modern day. It happens likely 150 to 200 years before modern day, although that's just my interpretation and it's not confirmed canonically. The story in Legends Arceus goes as follows. Arceus, well, I'll put right back up here where he was before. Arceus calls this 15-year-old child named Ray from present day into the past. He sends him back into the past to the Sinnoh region, but back when it was still known as Hisui. We don't really know why Arceus did this, but Ray shows up in Hisui. He's from the future. He doesn't know anything about the world of Hisui as it was back then, and the people he encounters are quite suspicious of him because it just so happens that around the time he arrived, a giant space-time rift distortion thing opened up above Mount Coronet. A lot of people think Ray might have something to do with it because he showed up after the distortion appeared. And so to prove himself, he works with the Galaxy Expedition team. And this is Professor Laventon that I'm using to represent them. They came from a bunch of other regions and formed this group in an effort to research Hisui and understand it better. And he works with Laventon to compile a Pokedex, a survey of all the different Pokemon that lived in the region at the time. And he is also tasked with quelling the Nobles. The Nobles are special Pokemon that are worshipped basically by the people of Hisui, by the Diamond and Pearl clans. And they were enraged by lightning that came from the distortion above Mount Coronet, and Ray helps calm them down, and a lot of what he's doing is to gain the favor of people and seem less suspicious, and presumably also in an effort to solve the mystery of his appearance in the past, and because he presumably wants to go back home. In the end, he does manage to close the rift after battling Dialga and Palkia, and saves the day, which kind of clears his name and people are no longer suspicious of him. But they still haven't figured out why the rift really appeared, and it turns out it appeared because of this guy, Volo. Volo is one of the original peoples of Hisui or Sinnoh, the Celestica people that I mentioned in the beginning. He got his hands on Giratina and used Giratina to tear open the rift, hoping that it would provoke Arceus, because he's kind of obsessed with Arceus and wants to reach it and use its power to change the world in some way. His objectives are a bit vague, but that didn't quite work because Ray closed the rift, so he is now attempting to collect all of Arceus's plates, which are the items Arceus uses to change its type, which it can do, in hopes that collecting all of them would summon Arceus. He fights Ray over the last plate, but loses. After he loses, he claims that he won't give up his goal, and he disappears. But it turns out he's probably immortal because he's mentioned to still be around in the modern day in Legends EA, even though we don't see him. So we don't exactly know. Maybe he gave up his ambitions to catch Arceus after a long time, or maybe he's planning something else that we'll see in a future game, although I don't think so. And that's the bizarre story of Legends Arceus. We got this guy being sent back into the past by Arceus to solve the rift above Mount Coronet and defeat this guy. We don't know if Ray ever went back home. This is the last event that I'll cover in this portion of the video, and that is the birth of Mewtwo. Now, if you recall, I said that Mew is regarded as the ancestor of all Pokemon. A bunch of researchers from Pokemon Mansion on Cinnabar Island in Kanto got their hands on Mew's DNA and planned to use it to create a clone. But the clone wasn't a faithful copy of Mew, but instead became a different Pokemon, which they creatively named Mewtwo. And Mewtwo was stronger and more aggressive than Mew, and it went berserk and hid itself in Cerulean Cave. And then the scientists who created it, including a guy named Dr. Fuji, who is now known as Mr. Fuji, they abandoned the mansion, and the mansion fell to ruin. And Fuji moved to Lavender Town, where he now just kind of takes care of Pokemon. He runs like a Pokemon shelter. But yeah, he used to be like a crazy scientist who helped clone Mew. And this is the end of the backstory or prehistory of Pokemon before the events in the modern day during the actual games. In this section of the video, I will explain the chronology of the actual Pokemon games, including how much time passes before every game. I want to make it clear that this is my interpretation of it, and a lot of it is based on sources that come from outside the games, sketchy sources, but I'll clarify which time gaps are canon and which are just my speculation, and you're welcome to disagree and have your own interpretation. I will prioritize third versions and remakes when referring to the events of a game, meaning I'm going with the latest revision of those events generally. When it comes to games that have two versions, I'll try to not favor one over the other and keep it vague where possible. When it comes to protagonists and addressing which protagonist is the canon one, I'll go with whichever one Pokemon Masters implies to be canon. Pokemon Masters is not canon to the games, but the games are canon to it. So if I refer to a protagonist and you think the other one is the canon one, you can replace it with that in your head. But I'm just doing it like this for the sake of simplicity. First in our timeline are the Kanto games, which were the first one to be released. I'll use this image of Pokemon Leaf Green to represent them, and I'll place it here, just to make this as easy to follow as possible. The events of the Kanto games are as follows. Two boys, Red and Blue, this is Red, our first player character, our first main character in Pokemon. They're tasked with completing a digital Pokedex by Blue's grandfather, Professor Oak. The reason he wants them to do it is because he's getting old and he can't really do it by himself. So the two of them leave on their Pokemon journeys. And Red goes across Kanto challenging all the gyms because he wants to obtain 8 gym badges and challenge the Pokemon League and become champion. But he runs into Team Rocket and their leader Giovanni, and Red takes it upon himself to deal with them. They're basically like the Kanto region's mafia, an organization. We'll see many more evil organizations like Team Rocket. Now Giovanni ends up being the final gym leader that Red has to face. It turns out Team Rocket has influence over the gym system itself as well. And he does actually defeat Giovanni. And after being defeated by someone as young as Red multiple times, Giovanni temporarily goes into hiding and disbands Team Rocket. After this, Red challenges the Pokemon League as he planned and becomes champion by defeating Blue. And then Professor Oak tells Red that he should go check out the Sevi Isles, a group of islands close to Kanto where there's Pokemon that you can't find in Kanto. And while there, Red runs into remnants of Team Rocket, and they have some small activities there as well, some business crime stuff. I don't know, stealing Pokemon, trafficking, that's what they do. And obviously Red gets rid of them and just defeats them and makes it clear that Team Rocket is no more and that Giovanni is gone. But while there, Red hears about two things that will become important in the future. He hears that Team Rocket was investigating radio technology, and he learns that Giovanni had a son. Next up, we have the story of the Hoenn games, which we think happens around the same time Red was journeying around Kanto. It's one of those things that aren't confirmed, but we're pretty sure. So I'm gonna represent the Hoenn games through this picture of Alpha Sapphire, because that was the first one I played, and I'll put it here. No, it happened at the same time. You get it. So two organizations similar to Team Rocket are active in the Hoenn region. We have Team Magma with their leader Maxi and Team Aqua with their leader Archie. They used to be just one faction they were friends and agreed on a bunch of things, but now they basically have opposing goals. What Team Magma wants to do is that they want to awaken Groudon and use its power to expand the Earth's landmass to make room for more human progress. You know, more land means you can build more cities, I guess. Make more farms, I don't know. And Team Aqua's goal is the exact opposite. They want to expand the oceans using Kyogre so that they might help the Pokemon who live in the sea. They want to return the Earth to a more natural state of mostly water, or it's already mostly water, even more water. So they begin to take action to achieve their plans in Hoenn. They have various ways in which they hope to awaken these Pokemon and control them. They are aided by a character called Zinnia, who disguises herself as a member of these organizations in order to help them awaken the legendaries. But thing is, Zinnia doesn't really care about their goals with Groudon and Kyogre. She has ulterior motives. She is one of the Draconids, the people who worship Rayquaza, and like I said before, the Draconids predicted that another meteor would hit the planet and that this one would be even bigger. Zinnia knows about this meteor and relies on Mega Rayquaza to stop it. But thing is, Rayquaza only shows up when Groudon and Kyogre are active and they're fighting or they're rampaging, so she's hoping that by helping Team Aqua and Team Magma awaken the super ancient Pokemon, that would also cause Rayquaza to show up, and then she could team up with it to stop the meteor. But that doesn't actually work out for her because Groudon and Kyogre are stopped by our next player character, Brandon. And so Zinnia has to do plan B. Because Rayquaza wasn't summoned, you know, because these two were stopped by Brandon, she wants to summon it herself, and she tries to do that by stealing a bunch of different people's keystone, which is what they're used for Mega Evolutions, and using that in a prayer to lure Rayquaza to Hoenn so they can go and stop the meteor. And Rayquaza is summoned, but sadly it does not acknowledge Zinnia as a worthy trainer and rejects her. And so our main character, Brandon, battles and teams up with Rayquaza instead. They destroy the meteor and save Hoenn, I guess. But also the mythical Pokemon Deoxys, who's a space virus, was on the meteor, so they had to beat Deoxys too. But presumably these events all happen around the same time. The Kanto games with Red and Team Rocket, and then the Hoenn games with Brandon and Teams Aqua and Team Magma. Next up, we have the events of the Johto games, which we know happened 3 years roughly after the events of the Kanto games, and by extension 3 years after the events of the Hoenn games. And I'm gonna use this picture of Soul Silver to represent the Johto games collectively. Now, in these games, another main character, this time a guy named Ethan, embarks on a journey really similar to Red's, but in Johto. He wants to get every gym badge and challenge the league. The league that Johto and Kanto have is shared because they're neighboring regions. He also meets a boy named Silver on his journey who becomes one of his rivals. He's important later. Just like Red, Ethan also runs into Team Rocket, but like I said, Giovanni went into hiding. The people running Team Rocket now are its admins. They're higher ups, but not not quite as capable as Giovanni. The most influential of the admins is this guy named Archer, who used to represent the villain for this game. What they want to do is hijack a radio signal. Remember, I mentioned that Team Rocket was looking into radio stuff all the way back in the Sevii Islands, and they use that in these games. They use it at the Lake of Rage to force the Magikarp to evolve and stuff, but most importantly, they want to hijack the radio tower in Goldenrod to broadcast a signal announcing that Team Rocket has returned so that Giovanni may come back and lead them once again. But Giovanni does not show. He doesn't respond in any way, and they get once again defeated by a very young trainer. They get defeated by Ethan. After this, Ethan does manage to challenge the Indigo League, and after that he goes to explore the Kanto region, which, like I said, neighbors Johto. And after fighting its gym leaders, he goes to Mount Silver, where he encounters Red. In this 3-year time gap, he disappeared and he went to Mount Silver to train, and now Ethan reached him there and they battle. The protagonist from the first game meets the protagonist from the second game. At some point, Ethan also has an encounter with Celebi in Ilex Forest in Johto. Celebi is a mythical Pokemon that can travel through time, and it sends Ethan into the past. And in the past, he witnesses two things. He learns that his rival Silver is actually Giovanni's son, that I mentioned before, and he's also teleported in the past to where Giovanni was hiding when Team Rocket was broadcasting their signal to call him back. It turns out that Giovanni wanted to respond to the signal and rejoin his underlings, but was defeated by Ethan. The reason he didn't show up earlier in the story is because Ethan from the future stopped him in the past, which is a bit confusing, but it's pretty interesting. And I feel like a lot of people might not know that, because you need an event to do this whole thing. You need the event Celebi to see this whole thing unfold. But yeah, that's the story with the Johto games. Next up, we have the Sinnoh games, which we also believe happen around the same time as the Johto games. And I'll use this picture of Pokemon Platinum to represent them. I'll put it right here on the timeline where the Johto games are, because they happen at once. So in these games, we see this guy named Cyrus, who is a descendant of one of the members of the Galaxy Expedition team from Legends Arceus, and he formed his own new Team Galactic, and he's got this crazy plan to capture Dialga and Palkia, like literally capture them, not catch them like the way you catch a Pokemon, and use the red chain, an item made from the Lake Spirit's body parts, to control them. And he hopes to use their powers to create a universe, because he sees the current universe as incomplete. He does manage to get pretty far in his plan, but capturing the two also summons Giratina, because as we see usually when Dialga and Palkia show up, Giratina is soon to follow. And Giratina takes Cyrus and drags him into the Distortion world, which, like I said, is kind of Giratina's home turf. He is followed there by the protagonist of the Sinnoh games, Dawn, who battles him in the Distortion world, but Cyrus decides to stay, so he kind of disappears in there forever, more or less solving this modern day crisis in Sinnoh. But there's another interesting thing here I'd like to mention. On her journey, Dawn also encounters a boy named Lucas, who is the region's professor's assistant. The roles of Dawn and Lucas can be swapped based on which one of them you choose to play as, but Lucas bears a striking resemblance to Ray, the protagonist from Legends Arceus. And of course, the other protagonist in that game, Akari, looks like Dawn. And we don't really know if the Legends Arceus protagonist is literally the protagonist from the modern day Sinnoh games sent back into the past, or just someone who resembles them, or a different alternate universe version of them. They never explain it, but the resemblance is obvious, and I'm pretty sure it's supposed to mean something. We just don't know what. Maybe it's a situation where Ray became his own grandpa. I hope that's not the case. That's pretty much what happens in the Sinnoh games, which take place at the same time as the Johto games, 3 years after the Kanto and Hoenn games. The Unova games are likely, in my opinion, to take place 3 years after the Johto and Sinnoh games, but we don't know this for sure. It's just kind of like my interpretation. I'll use this picture of Pokemon Black, because that's the first one I played, and I like Reshiram more, to represent them. The story in these games see Team Plasma led by a man named Ghetsis trying to take over the Unova region. Now, at first, they claim to be a humanitarian group, and they want to separate people from Pokemon because they think Pokemon are treated unfairly by people. They want to get rid of Pokeballs, and they want nobody to have a Pokemon, but they claim to do it for the sake of the Pokemon, which isn't actually true, but a lot of their members do believe it. They have a king named N, who is Ghetsis' adoptive son, who was basically the puppet leader of Team Plasma. Really, it's Ghetsis planning all of this out, and he groomed N into being their king. But N can communicate with Pokemon. He can understand what Pokemon are saying, he can basically talk to them, and wants to free them from humans. And the way Team Plasma plans to accomplish this is by catching the legendary dragons of Unova, who were once the original dragon, as I mentioned earlier, because whoever has their power will be respected by the people of Unova, but will also be a strong trainer. So if people don't comply with their conditions, they can just make them do what they want if they have a legendary dragon. And N is supposed to partner up with one of them because N has a very pure heart, which gets his thanks, will get the legendary dragons to collaborate with him. And that does actually work, and N captures one of them and turns it into his own Pokemon. But the protagonist of these games, Hilbert, who started his journey around the same time Team Plasma begun to move, also partners up with one of the legendary dragons because he opposes N. They have a rivalry where they kind of respect each other, right, the player and N, but they have opposing viewpoint because doesn't think that Pokemon need to be separated from people. And also, Team Plasma's real goals is just to take over the region. There is no, as you probably figured out, there's no real humanitarian angle to it. That's just a facade. That's just to get N and other people to collaborate. And after Hilbert defeats N has a change of heart. He understands through battling and befriending Hilbert how people and Pokemon can grow closer by being trainers, by having Pokemon do battles, and he sees it as less of a cruel thing. Now, N still hopes that in the future people won't need Pokeballs, but he doesn't think that Pokemon should be separated from people, quite the contrary. And because he has a change of heart, he abandons Team Plasma and disappears from Unova, and Team Plasma, including Ghetsis, is temporarily defeated. And then at some point after the main story, Hilbert also disappears from Unova because he wants to find N. We don't know where N goes, we just know that he's not in the region and that Hilbert went to follow him. Black and White 2 are sequels for the original Black and White, and they are explicitly stated to happen 2 years after Black and White. And I'm going to use this picture of Black 2 to represent them, you know, for continuity, because I used Black 1. In these games, Team Plasma return to their normally scheduled plans of taking over the region with the legendary dragon, but since both Reshiram and Zekrom are absent from the region, because like I said, Hilbert and N disappeared, they're gonna use Kyurem, who I mentioned before is the third dragon that can fuse with the other two. They want to use it to freeze Unova and just kind of one last desperate attempt to take over the region, led by Ghetsis again, but they're doing all of this with the help of a scientist named Colress, whose goals don't actually really align with Team Plasma. More of a character who kind of just wants to know what happens. He basically wants to find out how Pokemon can reach their potential and wants to test out if Team Plasma's ideology is correct. It's proven that it's not correct by this game's protagonist, Rosa, and when she defeats Colress just kind of quits helping Team Plasma. But that doesn't mean they're defeated because Ghetsis is still around. And Ghetsis does actually manage to take control over Kyurem, and when this is happening, N actually returns to the region, probably because he knows that all of this is happening, and tries to stop his adoptive father, but it doesn't quite work, and Kyurem fuses with N's legendary dragon. Obviously, Rosa has to stop them, which she does, and when this plan fails too, Team Plasma is gone for good, because, you know, this didn't work out either, so I guess they just disappeared. Unless we're getting Black and White 3, you know, I'd love to see that. Maybe they're the villains again, maybe Ghetsis tries something again. Who knows? It is believed that the events of Pokemon X and Y also take place around the same time as the events of Black 2 and Y 2, so I'm gonna put this little picture of Pokemon Y over here, because the events in Black 2 and Y 2 and X and Y are apparently contemporaneous. The story of these games involves Lysander, the leader of an organization called Team Flare, who is also a descendant of AZ's brother, the king, he knows the location of the ultimate weapon because, like I said, the location was passed down in AZ's family, and he wants to use the ultimate weapon to basically kill everyone in the world aside from Team Flare, which sounds absurd, but it's actually the story of this game. He wants to use the legendary Pokemon of the Kalos region, Xerneas and Yveltal, as a battery for the weapon and fire it. Once again, like most villains in Pokemon, he gets pretty close to accomplishing his goal, but the protagonist in Pokemon X and Y, Serena, actually manages to free the legendary Pokemon that the ultimate weapon was using as a battery and stop Lysander's plan. But with the little power that the ultimate weapon still had, Lysander fires it, but it doesn't quite work right, and instead of killing everyone in the world, the charge from the weapon just kind of falls back onto it, so it self-destructs. Pretty much. Lysander is hit, but is rescued by Zygarde, who I also didn't print a picture of, and he loses part of his memory and becomes immortal, but no one really knew that at that point. After this, Serena battles AZ, who is still around because, like I explained, he can't die, and in their battle, AZ kind of becomes a little less sad, you know, like, because he's been spending the past 30,000 years regretting what he did, and now he feels, I guess, a little bit better about it because someone, Serena, helped destroy the ultimate weapon, and it's been a long time. And so after their battle, his Floette, finally, after 3,000 years, as everyone knows, returns to him. And you know, at the time, you could have assumed that the reason Floette returned is just because AZ became a better person over the last 3,000 years, and she wants him to be her trainer again. But there is actually another reason for why that happened, but we'll get into that later. The Alola games are set to take place 2 years after X and Y, and then Black 2 and Y 2, so I'll put them here. Running out of space a little bit, I might have to reorganize this. But in Alola, the Aether Foundation, led by its president Lusamine, opened a branch. She's researching ultra wormholes, which, as I explained earlier in the video, are a phenomenon tied to Alola. They keep happening here, and they're tied to the events in the region's history. At some point, she makes contact with the Ultra Recon Squad, a group of people from Ultra Megalopolis, where Necrozma is being kept. And it turns out that Necrozma is very close to breaking out, and when it does, it'll come to Alola again and try to steal its light like it did many, many years ago. And Lusamine wants to protect Alola from Necrozma, and she kind of teams up with the Ultra Recon Squad to do this. Now, what she claims she wants to do is to use the legendary Pokemon Cosmog, who, like I said, is the offspring of Solgaleo and Lunala, to open ultra wormholes and send Pokemon and trainers to where Necrozma is so they can defeat it. But her daughter, Lily, who doesn't want Cosmog to suffer, steals it from the Aether Foundation because Cosmog is a little baby Pokemon and it exerts itself tremendously when it opens an ultra wormhole, and Lily just doesn't want it to be experimented on. She probably doesn't know the full scope of Lusamine's plans. And so Lusamine's plans are halted temporarily because Cosmog is missing. Now Lily, her daughter, ends up befriending the protagonist of these games, this guy named Elio. Lusamine and the Aether Foundation catch wind of Lily's location, and they use a local gang called Team Skull to recapture Cosmog. Lily and Elio attempt to retrieve Cosmog from the Aether Foundation, but Lusamine does use it to open an ultra wormhole, and she goes to fight Necrozma herself, but thankfully Cosmog survives. Lusamine could not defeat Necrozma, and she gets wrecked by it and gets spat back out to Alola through an ultra wormhole after Necrozma is done with it. But Nebby evolves into its legendary form and attempts to fight off Necrozma, but sadly Necrozma is too powerful and actually absorbs it because, like I said, Solgaleo and Lunala have the same properties as a star, so Necrozma can siphon their light, and then it disappears back into Ultra Megalopolis. It turns out the Ultra Recon Squad had another legendary Pokemon that can open wormholes that Elio uses to reach Necrozma, and he actually battles Necrozma himself, and after a grueling battle, because Necrozma is actually really hard in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, Necrozma is defeated and Alola is safe from the threat of having its light stolen again. The story of Sword and Shield happened sometime after the Alola games, but we don't exactly know when. It just know it happens afterwards. So I'll put it right over here. A little picture of Pokemon Shield. In these games, this guy, Chairman Rose, the chairman of the Pokemon League in this region, wants to awaken Eternatus. Remember the Meteor Pokemon once again, because he wants to use Eternatus' energy to prevent an energy crisis in the far-off future. Basically, he thinks the region will run out of power, and he thinks he can use Eternatus to solve this problem early. As it usually goes when it comes to villains waking up legendary Pokemon in this universe, it doesn't really go according to his plan, and Eternatus just kind of starts the darkest day too. A bunch of Pokemon start to Dynamax just like they did in the past 3,000 years ago. But the game's protagonist, Gloria, of course, is there, and her rival Hop managed to team up with the legendary Pokemon Zacian and Zamazenta, who originally stopped the Darkest Day, and stop Eternatus once more, this time also capturing it. At some point after Eternatus is stopped, Gloria ventures into the Crown Tundra in the southern part of Galar, where Calyrex from earlier is. Calyrex is the Pokemon with the steeds that lost its power because people forgot it existed, and Gloria helps it reunite with one of its steeds and regain its powers back. We're almost at the end because we finally reached Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which take place at some point after Sword and Shield. The protagonist, Juliana, who just came to Paldea, enrolls in Naranja Academy and starts journeying around the region. She encounters Arvin, who is the son of the region's professor, Sada, and she receives the legendary Pokemon Koraidon from him. Sada tasks Juliana to help Koraidon regain its powers, which it lost at some point after leaving the Great Crater of Paldea, which is where the professor is right now, researching. After Koraidon regains its power, the professor tells Juliana to come to Area Zero to help her with something. And when she gets there, the professor reveals that actually they're not the professor. They're an AI copy of the professor who actually perished a long time ago. How is any of this possible? Professor Sada was obsessed with Area Zero because of the book that Heath wrote about his experiences there 200 years prior. He wrote about encountering Pokemon from other times, and Professor Sada wanted to see these Pokemon of the past for herself. So she started studying in Area Zero and researching its properties. It turns out that the reason all of this was going on there was because there's some crystals growing there that can be used to create hyper advanced technology that isn't normally possible, and it also seems like they can tie together different timelines, although their exact properties aren't explained in full. And so the professor built a time machine using the crystals so that she could bring the Pokemon of the past into the modern world because she was so fascinated by them. And she built an AI copy of herself also using the crystals to make the whole process easier on her. But the professor died in an accident, and the AI was the only one that remained. Thing is, the AI reached the conclusion that stopping the time machine would be better because releasing Pokemon from the past into Paldea would throw the ecosystem out of balance, but the AI could not act to turn off the machine because it would go against its programming. So the AI asks Juliana to do all that. But the hard part comes when Juliana has to fight the AI to turn off the machine. The AI doesn't want to battle her, but it has to because it's in its programming. So when she attempts to turn off the machine, the AI starts what is called the Paradise Protection Protocol, and a battle ensues. Juliana manages to defeat the Paradise Protection Protocol with the help of Koraidon and destroy the time machine. The AI is also sent into a different time and disappears completely. Now, at some point, Juliana gets invited on a school field trip to Kitakami, which I mentioned before, where the Pokemon Ogerpon is. If you remember from earlier in the video, Ogerpon's reputation was ruined, and the people of Kitakami hate it because they think it killed the Loyal Three for no reason, whereas in reality, Ogerpon killed them in self-defense. And while there, Juliana ends up encountering Ogerpon and clearing its reputation with the people of Kitakami with the help of a local boy named Kieran. But in the process, she also befriends Ogerpon. Now, Kieran, having had an admiration for Ogerpon ever since he was little, hates that Ogerpon is friends with Juliana and not him, so he gets all sad about it. Later on, Juliana is once again invited to a new location, Blueberry Academy in Unova, where Kieran goes to school, and it turns out in the meantime he became the toughest trainer in his school, and he was motivated by sheer rage and jealousy. But of course, Juliana, because she's the main character and you play as her, defeats Kieran once again. But they get invited to Area Zero, both of them, by Briar, one of the professors at the academy, who is a descendant of Heath and is much like the deceased professor interested in the phenomenons in Area Zero, in the Great Crater. And they encounter the Pokemon Terapagos, another legendary. And it would appear that Terapagos is related to, or the actual source of the crystals and their weird phenomena within Area Zero. Because Kieran doesn't want to get bested by Juliana again, he actually uses a Master Ball to catch Terapagos, but Terapagos doesn't actually listen to him, kind of goes berserk. So Kieran and Juliana have to team up to stop it, so they kind of make up and subdue Terapagos. Now we've finally reached the most recent point in the Pokemon timeline with the latest game, Pokemon Legends ZA. And we don't know when Legends ZA takes place in relation to Pokemon Shield or Violet, but we do know that it takes place 5 years after X and Y, and also Black 2 and White 2, and so it's also 3 years after the Alola games. And I'll put it over here. I hope that still makes sense. This game takes us back to Kalos and picks up where X and Y left off. Well, actually it's 5 years later, but it continues the story. Remember how I said that Floette might have returned to AZ for a different reason other than him just being nicer now? Well, it turns out that Floette returned because Angie, the counterpart to the ultimate weapon that AZ also built, begun to react when the ultimate weapon was fired off by Lysander at the end of X and Y. Quasartico Inc., a company that was put in charge with renovating Lumio City after the city was in a bad place after the whole Team Flare incident, noticed that something was happening with Angie because it's within Prism Tower, the tower in the center of the city. They didn't really know what Angie was, but they noticed that the tower began to act weirdly and it was spewing out Mega Energy, which was causing Pokemon to Mega Evolve spontaneously in the city and go rogue, which was bad and dangerous. But they didn't really know what to do about it because even though Floette had returned to AZ, who by the way started running a hotel now, because of course that's what you do in that situation. Even though Floette was with AZ, he couldn't use Floette to man Angie and stop it from spewing out Mega Energy because he was too old and he just wasn't capable as a trainer. But also, not just anybody would be able to do that, so they needed a person who would be a strong Mega Evolution user to Mega Evolve Floette in order to control Angie and stop it from spewing out Mega Energy and causing Rogue Mega Evolution to happen in the city. And so Quasartico Inc., with the help of AZ, started an event known as the ZA Royale, where various people in Lumios would compete with each other and climb ranks in order to determine who the strongest trainer, and by extension the strongest Mega Evolution user in the city is. One of the factions that was competing in this was Team MZ, led by Tawny. They're people who lived in AZ's hotel. They wanted to win the ZA Royale because the person who does is said to be awarded a wish. By the way, the people don't know what the true purpose of the ZA Royale is, but they have an incentive to win because Quasartico Inc. would grant them anything within the realm of possibility. This is where the player character, Harmony, oh, by the way, I'm picking her not because she's in Masters, I'm just picking her because I like her more. But Harmony shows up in Lumio City as a tourist and joins Team MZ. And of course, because you play as her and she's the main character, you win the ZA Royale. And with the help of everyone in the city, you help stop Angie from going rogue. And that's how the story of the main game ends. But recently, there's been a DLC for this game. It's more like a separate story. I won't add it on the board. But a weird portal appears above Angie, above its ruins, and various rifts begin to pop out around Lumios, and nobody really knows what they are. A little kid named Ansha, who is, by the way, the region champion's daughter, shows up to Team MZ at their hotel and demands that they help her make a donut because she's accompanied by the mythical Pokemon Hoopa. And it turns out Hoopa's power can be used to enter these little holes, these little rifts and distortions that have been popping out in Lumio City. And the reason Ansha is interested in using Hoopa's power to do that is because she wants to capture Rayquaza for her mother, because her mother's a strong trainer, and she caught a glimpse of it within those little portals. When those portals are entered by the members of Team MZ, they encounter a distorted reality. It's almost like the regular Lumio City, but weird and evil and gray. And the Pokemon, there are Pokemon that you can't normally find in Lumios. They basically want to understand why this is happening and also help Ansha. Turns out that this other dimension with the strange Pokemon where Ansha saw Rayquaza isn't really real. It's an illusion that was created by the Pokemon Darkrai. Darkrai is a mythical Pokemon that gives people nightmares, like a defense mechanism. That's how a Darkrai drives people away to defend itself. But it turns out a Darkrai was in Lumio City when Angie went rogue and underwent Mega Evolution. And now under the stress of a whole lot of Mega energy, it created this dream dimension that people can now enter physically. Basically, Darkrai's powers were amplified by Mega Evolution, and it created this alternate dimension that in the DLC they call Hyperspace Lumios. So of course, you stop Darkrai, well, Harmony stops Darkrai, and you also later help Ansha capture a Rayquaza. It's very ambiguous whether the Pokemon encountered in Hyperspace Lumios are even real, because Hyperspace Lumios is supposed to be a dream, but then again, the Pokemon that people encounter in it can be brought into the real world. So do they actually exist? Were they created by Darkrai, or were they pulled into that dimension from other places in the world by Darkrai? But that's the latest thing to ever happen in Pokemon, and it brings our timeline to an end. The Kanto games and the Hoenn games taking place at once, and then 3 years later you have the Johto and Sinnoh games. 3 years after that, according to my version of the timeline, you have Black and White. 2 years after that, we have Black 2 and White 2 and X and Y. 2 years after that, we have the Alola games. At some point after that, it's Pokemon Sword and Shield. At some point after that, it's Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. And 5 years after X and Y and Black 2 and White 2 is Pokemon Legend ZA, meaning that Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet happened somewhere in the 3-year gap between the Alola games and Pokemon Legend ZA. But more on that in the final section of the video, where I'll explain all of this.
Now I will attempt to explain my interpretation of the Pokemon game timeline. I will once again remind you that this is just the conclusion I reached. I had to use extraneous clues to figure this out, and a lot of it is by no means hard canon, so you're welcome to disagree with my version of the chronology. For the sake of simplicity, I'm treating different versions or remakes of the same game as interchangeable, because the broad strokes of the events in each region's games are the same regardless of version differences or changes made by remakes. There's some evidence to suggest that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire takes place later in the timeline than the Gen 3 Hoenn games, but I just don't think it's convincing enough, and I wouldn't know exactly how much later to place it, so I think it's easier and makes more sense to lump it in with the other versions of those games, since they all do cover mostly the same story and have the same characters. Also, Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee seem to be in a completely different timeline, so I won't connect them to the other mainline games. But in short, they take place in a universe where the creation of Oak's Pokedex and Team Rocket's defeat took place some years later, and so Red and Blue had normal Pokemon journeys without stopping Giovanni and without getting electronic Pokedexes. Instead, new characters get to do all that at a later point in time. That's who you play as. I reckon they take place somewhere around this time span, just in a more significantly different timeline than the smaller universe variations between the other games. I used Mina's age in these games in relation to her age in the Alola games to place them here. Now back to the broader general Pokemon timeline. Legends Arceus obviously takes place before all the other games, and I think it happens about 150 to 200 years before the modern day, because the period of Hokkaido's history that the game seems to be inspired by was around that time, but well, also because a leaked pitch document for the game says it was supposed to be set around 150 years in the past, at least during that stage of development. But honestly, this game is temporally so far removed from the ones that take place in the modern day that exactly how long ago Legends Arceus was doesn't have much of an impact on the timeline. The reason I put the Kanto and Hoenn games in the same place on my timeline is because of a now deleted tweet from Game Freak employee Toshinobu Matsumiya where he said they happen around the same time. The reason I placed the Johto games 3 years after that is because the games straight up tell you that 3 years have passed since the events of the Kanto games. But I also put all the Sinnoh games here because that same Matsumiya tweet said they take place around the same time as the Johto games. I personally like to think that Black and White happened 2 years after the Johto and Sinnoh games, but you'll have to wait a bit for my explanation on that one because it relates to future games. However, a leaked internal document from Game Freak claims that Black and White take place 10 years after the Johto and Sinnoh games, so you could go with that since it's from the devs, although it wasn't meant to be seen by the public and it seems to have been made back in 2011. I'll explain later why it might be outdated. Black 2 and White 2 canonically take place 2 years after the original Black and White. We're told so explicitly in the actual game, so that's an easy one. But according to the Matsumiya tweet, X and Y also take place around that same time, simultaneously with Black 2 and White 2, so I placed them in the same spot on my timeline. The reason I put the Alola games 2 years after Black 2 and White 2 and X and Y is because Grimsley, a character from Black and White and Black 2 and White 2, appears in the Alola games with a new design. Some versions of his concept art claim that this is him 2 years later, and since the last time we saw him was in Black 2 and White 2, we can probably infer that the Alola games where this Grimsley design is featured take place 2 years after Black 2 and White 2 and by extension 2 years after X and Y. The Alola games also feature the return of Red and Blue from the Kanto games. Much like with Grimsley, some versions of their new design's concept art have added annotations. For them, it's their names followed by the number 20. Now this number could mean 20 years later or just be a reference to the fact that it was Pokemon's 20th anniversary, but I kinda wanna think it's just their ages. Like, Red 20 sounds like you're describing how old he is. I will not show these versions of their concept art with the 20 annotations because they came from leaks too and I don't want this video to be taken down, but if we interpret it to mean Red and Blue are 20 years old in the Alola games, it would probably mean the Kanto games took place 9 years prior, since Gen 1 manuals usually state Red to be 11. This is why I placed Black and White only 2 years after the Johto and Sinnoh games in my timeline. It's the only way Red and Blue's ages would line up with them being 20 in the Alola games. The 2011 document that claims the gap between the Johto and Sinnoh games and Black and White is 10 years is way older than the Red and Blue's concept art stating them to be 20 in the Alola games, and I think the newer evidence should have priority because it's presumably more up to date. At the end of the day, both of the documents in questions were never meant to be seen by the public, so take them with a grain of salt. But I personally just prefer the idea that in the Alola games, Red and Blue are the same age their debut games were at the time, which is 20, rather than this being them 20 years after those games. I believe Sword and Shield takes place sometime after the Alola games, mainly because they debuted the Rotom phone, which became widespread in all regions, as evidenced by the games that came out after Sword and Shield. To me, it makes sense to assume that games where the Rotom phones aren't present likely take place before Sword and Shield. And there's also the fact that the technology of putting Rotom in a handheld multi-purpose device seemed new and experimental in the Alola games, which to me implies it was the success of the Rotom decks that led to Rotom phones becoming a thing. We also know that Scarlet and Violet take place after Sword and Shield because Sonia's book that she writes in Sword and Shield can be found in a library in Scarlet and Violet. Also, the Rotom phones in these games look like newer models of the Sword and Shield versions. I placed Legend ZA sometime after Scarlet and Violet in my timeline because the Rotom phones in that game seem even more upgraded. Additionally, we know for sure that Legend ZA takes place after Sword and Shield because Leon is mentioned to no longer be champion, which in Sword and Shield happens because the player defeats him. But most importantly, Legend ZA tells us directly that it takes place 5 years after X and Y. Earlier, we established that the Alola games likely take place 2 years after X and Y, meaning Legend ZA takes place 3 years after the Alola games. And since Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet take place after the Alola games but before Legend ZA according to my timeline, it means they happen sometime in the 3-year gap between the Alola games and Legend ZA. Taking everything I said into account, I can surmise that as of Legend ZA, a total of 12 years passed from the beginning of Red's journey at the start of the Pokemon timeline, at least according to me based on questionable and unclear evidence. Based on interviews with the devs, the fact that Matsumiya deleted his tweet, and just playing the games like normal, it's clear to me that Game Freak doesn't want to give exact dates or confirm time skips for their games unless they're direct sequels to previous installments. This way, they can more safely bring back old characters or retcon the timeline without having to worry about adhering to rigorous pre-established chronologies. Keeping the continuity loose gives them fewer constraints, I'm aware of that. Still, it's fun to take what little evidence we have and try to figure things out, even if future entries in the series throw a spanner in the works and reframe our understanding of the order of events in Pokemon. I hope you derived some enjoyment from this video. I hope it's not too incomprehensible. I wasn't that confident in it since I've never done live segments before and it was the first time I didn't have a script to read off of. Let me know if you liked the pinboard or if it was too much of a gimmick. If you really did watch all the way through, I am sincerely grateful, and as always, thank you for your time.